In this section, we'll look how the United States reacted to the growing power of the fascists from about 1933 to 1937. Most Americans at this time remained isolationist. A congressional committee led by Senator Gerald Nye, the so-called Nye Committee, concluded in the mid-1930s that American munitions industries had made huge profits during World War I and had actually pressed the American government to enter the war. This was given the fact that the war had ended so badly, many Americans were surprised that the munitions industry had gotten them into war, and they said, we're not going to make that mistake again. The bitter end to World War I had just increased America's sense of isolationism. We're just not going to make that mistake again. If another European war broke out, America, the majority believe, should remain neutral. It should not get involved in another great cost and expense when it had little to gain, like World War I. In time, the isolationists organized the America First Committee. At its peak, it had over 800,000 Americans as members and over 450 chapters nationally. Its members included a number of prominent people, including not only Senator Nye, but the American novelist Sinclair Lewis and the famed aviator Charles Lindbergh, shown giving a speech here. Given the strength of the isolationists in the mid-1930s, Congress passed several so-called Neutrality Acts to assure that if a war broke out, the U.S. would remain neutral. Looking back at what had led America into World War I, the first legislation was the Neutrality Act of 1935, which passed in August of that year and prohibited the trading of munitions with any countries at war. Munitions included anything directly applicable to a nation's war effort, things like guns and ammunitions and so forth. The law didn't make any distinction between which countries at war were the aggressors or victims. Either way, no munitions would come from the United States. The 1935 law also declared that if any American traveled on a ship of a country at war, they did so at their own risk. The 1935 legislation, however, lasted only 6 months, and so in February 1936, Congress renewed its provisions with the Neutrality Act of 1936. The 36 legislation also prohibited loans or any credits to nations at war. Of course, not everybody in the United States in the mid-1930s were isolationists. A minority believed that if the war broke out, it would inevitably drag America into it. The U.S. shouldn't isolate itself like America First advocated, but get involved diplomatically to prevent the conflict in the first place. These interventionists didn't want war, of course, but they sought to prevent it and, in the very least, ensure that the United States was prepared if war broke out. Among the group of people who took this point of view was the President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt. On October 5, 1937, in Chicago, FDR gave a speech that really angered the isolationists. In the so-called quarantine speech, FDR proposed the international community quarantine the aggressor nations by refusing to trade with them. No countries were directly mentioned in the speech, but all observers took it to be aimed at Germany, Italy, and Japan. No countries followed up on the speech with actual legislation, but American isolationists were outraged. Of course, FDR wasn't in the majority in Congress in 1937, and Congress responded with another bit of neutrality legislation, the Neutrality Act of 1937, which went a bit further than the legislation passed in 1935 and 36. The new legislation prohibited any trade with countries at war of non-military goods, just about anything, except on a cash and carry basis. Now what that meant was that you had to pay cash up front. Now if you paid cash up front and then something happened to you, got blown up on the way back to your country, it didn't concern the United States. And carry meant that you have to pick up the goods in your own ships. Again, if the ship got blown up going back to its country, it wouldn't involve the United States. As a matter of fact, isolationism was also evident with the Panay Incident in December 12, 1937. The USS Panay was on the Yangtze River to protect American lives and interests in China. Japanese aircraft, however, attacked the flat-bottomed gunboat and sank it. They killed four Americans and wounded 43. Japan claimed that it didn't see the American flags, and it actually apologized, agreeing to pay an indemnity. It was clear to many Americans, however, that the attack was intentional, sort of a warning to the United States not to intervene with Japan's efforts in China, a deliberate assault and thus an act of war. Still, however, the United States accepted the apology and did nothing else, a sign of the power of the isolationist sentiment. The public simply didn't want to go to war, even if we were directly attacked. This concludes the section on how America reacted to the growing power of the fascists through 1937.